So next one, specifically very much on energy, the Covenant of Mayors on Energy. 5 of the repair partners have signed this, and I expect most of you know it, but it's a voluntary agreement where the leaders of local authorities commit to reducing the CO2 emissions of their city by more than the EU targets. So it's quite ambitious. And they decide, once they commit to signing this, they're going to set up a sustainable energy action plan. And so this has very much influenced discussions during the project. The partners would like to recommend, actually, having looked at the guidance which the European Commission has published in relation to the Covenant of Mayors, there's scope to actually have a little bit more specific guidance on how you do this in heritage areas. It's quite challenging to work out energy efficiency measures and to have renewable energy, for example, in large areas of historic city centres dominated by protected buildings. It's tough. So a little bit more specific attention to the topic. So next one, please. Thank you. The policy for urban mobility, our pillar on transport. On the topic of sustainable transport, the partners are really quite enthusiastic about the Commission's Urban Mobility Action Plan, which took a very long time to come out. There was a delay of over a year in publishing it, but when it did come out, it's pretty good. So there are a lot of actions in there which are really of interest to all local authorities dealing with this issue. And the partners would especially like to call attention to the special access problems of sites such as the ones we've been looking at today. And you could see in the example from Utrecht the importance of having a multi-level governance approach where you have a good national strategy and transport plans at regional and local level and at the level of the site, which are integrated, which enable sustainable mobility solutions, walking, cycling, and water transport, as actually we saw a great deal of course, in the Netherlands. So really quite inspiring. So on the whole, this is a pretty positive area of policy at the moment. Next one, EU policy for culture. This is related to the conservation pillar. There is EU policy for culture, but of course it focuses mostly on things not to do with built heritage, but language, folklore, traditions, music, arts, those kind of things are a little bit softer. However, the built heritage is really an important aspect. At the moment, it's quite a small part of EU cultural policy and a small part of the cultural funding programme. But we think there's a logic, actually, in suggesting that there should be more attention to the actual buildings and the military heritage, and as I think Arnold explained in his introduction, it's very symbolic of the EU and the way it's gone. So we'd like to strengthen that. And we'd also like some closer working between the European Commission and the Council of Europe in what's called joint programming, which is the idea of a joint funding programme where we would be able to pursue some of these particular issues to do with the heritage sites. Okay, next one. The EU 2020 flagships again. This is in relation to the pillar on local employment, our local jobs. The repair partners are very much welcoming this flagship and just in a general way calling for recognition of the kinds of economic impacts that can be achieved at local level if you use your heritage sites and military sites in a clever way, such as we saw especially in Karlskrona. So, next one. Thanks. Oh, sorry, I should just add one thing, which was that the importance of skills. Dealing with these kind of areas of cities calls for specialist qualifications. You have to have a very skilled workforce to be able to work on these old buildings and green areas and so on. And there is a need for a lot of training. So on that aspect, we have actually discussed that quite strongly, and perhaps it wasn't mentioned a great deal today, but it's a really important part of the work. So next one, the Innovation Union. Of all the flagships, this one is perhaps of most immediate relevance for the jobs pillar because of its fostering of this clustering idea using the triple helix. So the partners see this as very relevant for their action. But there's a particular thing that we like to recommend, which is that to say that at the moment everybody knows that in the European programmes there is scope to get money to foster the triple helix approach and these clusterings of different sectoral groups of small companies within a city, as we saw with Telecom City in Karlskrona. And there's a particular opportunity to do that at the moment in the research framework program. It's something called Regions of Knowledge. The next opening call for this month is going to be on energy clusters, which is highly relevant for the partners here. But we know that there's a threat to this particular budget in the new programs, because we think that national governments think that this kind of activity should be restricted to Interreg type of activity. And actually the regions of knowledge within FP7 is pretty good. So we might need to defend it at a certain point. Okay? Here we are, rapidly reaching recommendation 10, and there are only 11, so I'm going as fast as I can. Recommendation 10, policy for sustainable urban development. And here my comments are directed to our colleague from the Romanian Ministry. I'm glad that you're still here with us. And you'll see that here we see a need for our ministers responsible for urban policy and spatial planning to work a little more closely with their colleagues, the national environment ministers. And we think this would greatly strengthen their work. So we very much appreciate all the intensive work that the ministers are doing on the new funding programs, especially the opportunities to do urban work in the new structural and cohesion funds. However, there are some other things perhaps they could be doing using other European measures and not only funding. And there are two suggestions here, and I think we could probably come up with some more. And the first thing is, we'd like the national ministers for urban policy to adopt a council recommendation about sustainable urban development. And it's probably something that the environment ministers would have to do at the Environment Council. And this comes from knowing that in the past, our environment ministers have adopted recommendations in other parts of work at European level which are not formally part of the EU agenda. They're not European competences, they're national competences. So we have such recommendations in the area of forestry and also integrated coastal zone management. And it creates a very nice, secure basis for continuing to work and to especially to ask for money in the future. So probably this isn't going to go anywhere, but it could be quite a useful thing to do. The second one relates to EMAS. I don't know if you're using the Environmental Management and Audit Scheme in cities in Romania, for example, but it's familiar to a lot of people working in companies who use, for example, ISO 14001. It's a kind of sustainability or environmental certification system. It's a voluntary thing at European level, but it's very well established. But at the moment, it's only environment. So I think it was Malcolm from Malta who mentioned corporate social responsibility quite a lot in our discussions. And here's a way to add social and corporate responsibility and economic matters into the EMAS regulation and make a sustainability management and audit scheme for cities to use, which would be a kind of certification for local authorities as a badge of honour about their sustainability. So an interesting idea, but we don't know whether the ministers would find this of interest to pursue. Okay, and finally, one more. This is something that's come onto the agenda relatively recently in the context of the discussions on EU 2020 and the new funding programmes. The Committee of the Regions at European level has for some time been promoting the role of local and regional authorities in delivering the EU policy agenda. So we heard a lot about the role of cities in implementing the old Lisbon agenda and the EU Sustainable Development Strategy. And now in EU 2020, we're in a new situation where multi-level governance is much more normally accepted. And there's no reason why the fundamentally important role of local and regional government should not be formalised. Okay? So the Committee of Regions have proposed the use of something called the Territorial Pact, which is in some ways quite similar to a normal structural fund programme that I'm sure you know about, where you have a set of commitments based around the EU 2020 goals. And an agreement is made within a country between national government, regional and cities or local authorities around the agenda of the EU 2020, or maybe around just one of the flagships. And this could become the basis for managing some structural funds money in future. There's a particular thing called a global grant, which some local authorities would quite like to have. And this is going somewhere at the moment. The proposal came last year, and in the last few months, the European Commission has decided they like it. The European Parliament has adopted, and this very week there are further discussions about this. So in the context of discussions about the future funding available for work on sustainable urban development, we'd like to welcome this approach and say that projects like Repair can see, the practitioners from Repair working at the level of the cities can see that such an instrument might actually be quite useful. So we'd quite like to ask our national governments to help by putting this in place in the future. So I think that's all our suggestions, and I hope you'll see when you see the final products, especially the Repair Policy Framework, where some of the discussion on the national context will be discussed. You'll see that there you'll find the evidence and the linkage between the local good practice and these emerging suggestions for the European level to help us all to work more effectively. So I think the partners would welcome your feedback on these. Thanks very much.